Why did I draft Le'Veon Bell over Julio Jones? Because everyone in this Dynasty startup that I participated in recently, it's called the Ultimate Dynasty Podcast League. So it's myself and a bunch of other Dynasty podcast hosts. Were you invited?
I didn't get an invite to that.
Well, I was invited. And other Dynasty podcast hosts from shows like the Dynasty Trade Calculator, the Dynasty Happy Hour, the Dynasty Dummies, the Dynasty Gurus, Under the Helmet.
I haven't heard of most of these.
Under the Helmet was represented. Dynasty Life Podcast. You know all these names.
Oh, God. Yeah, I've heard of them all.
You're fans of all these shows. Stop lying. So I'm drafting at mid to late first round. Julio Jones is on the board. Le'Veon Bell is on the board. It's between those two players, the obvious next selections. And Kyle from the Dynasty Dummies assumed I was going to take Julio Jones, so he already had Le'Veon Bell queued up and just that's what he expected would happen. He already penciled Le'Veon Bell onto his roster. Next thing he knows, he has Julio Jones. I have Le'Veon Bell. And he was befuddled because he thought of me as Mr. Zero RB because on the other show that we do, the Mind of Mansion show on the Roto Underworld radio channel, we talk a lot about Zero RB. I'm a Zero RB zealot in a redraft context, but not in a Dynasty League context because Dynasty and redraft are very different. In one format, you own the player for life. In the other format, you roster the player for one season. And that makes all the difference when you're comparing wide receivers to running backs. Because I do not implement zero RB in Dynasty. More often, I implement robust running back. You don't want to do a value-based approach in any format. You want to have a strategy. Just taking best player available is not a strategy. It does not account for positional volatility and fragility, and it doesn't take advantage of any of the game theory aspects of drafting. So just going down the list, best player available, that's never the right approach. Have a strategy, and usually that means accumulating a number of players at a particular position in swaths throughout the draft. And in this startup, I surprised people by drafting numerous running backs in the early rounds. Le'Veon Bell, Melvin Gordon, Tevin Coleman, Duke Johnson. And I was relatively thin at the wide receiver position. And this was befuddling to anyone that's watched me draft in a redraft context. Complete opposite world. Why is that? Well, when we look at this Bell versus Julio Jones decision, it's illuminating. First of all, Bell's 3 years younger, a full 3 years younger. Bell just turned 25. Julio Jones just turned 28. Last season, Le'Veon Bell scored 26.4 fantasy points per game in comparison to Julio Jones' 18.6 fantasy points per game. That's an almost 8 points per game differential. Now, on playerprofiler.com, we also have a metric called value over stream. Your fantasy points per game above and beyond the most likely replacement on the waiver wire. Le'Veon Bell's value over stream was the greatest in the history of playerprofiler.com. Plus 17.8 value over stream. I've never seen a number that high. That was bigger than David Johnson because Le'Veon Bell played less games, so his number was higher. Julio Jones' value over stream was a relatively modest 7.8 when compared to Le'Veon Bell. So let me get this straight. Le'Veon Bell has a VOS, value over stream, 10 points higher than Julio Jones, and he's 3 years younger, and there's a debate about which player I should select? Hell no! Le'Veon Bell's at the age apex. He's in his peak. Julio Jones is past his prime. Last season was prime Julio Jones. As of 2017, he is past his prime. He is on the downslope of his career. Le'Veon Bell remains at the peak of his powers. So for just those reasons alone, just based on value, Le'Veon Bell has an incredible advantage. Now, why would you potentially avoid Le'Veon Bell in redraft? Because the running back position is more fragile on a year-to-year basis. And by fragile, I don't mean injury-prone. I mean running back projections are more uncertain year-to-year. There's four main reasons for this. The first reason is running back is an interdependent position. A decline in overall team efficiency throttles the running back production more dramatically than the wide receiver production. Secondly, running back and offensive line exist in a symbiotic relationship. Ineffective run blocking cripples running back production. We've talked about this. The thought exercise. What happens if Jerick McKinnon and Ezekiel Elliott trade places? How does Elliott do on Minnesota with the worst run-blocking offensive line in football? How does Jerick McKinnon do as a bell cow for Dallas? Think about it. The reasons for that disparity are offensive efficiency and offensive line effectiveness. Those things impact running back output more than they impact wide receiver production. Running backs are also more susceptible to being influenced by external forces like game flow. There are games in which the running back, like a LeGarrette Blount, for example, gets very few touches because the Patriots are losing and they're not on the field in the second half. That doesn't happen to the wide receiver. And finally, running backs are more injury prone year to year. So you add all those reasons up, you stack those factors up, it's easy to understand why it's harder to project annual running back production. So if I think Le'Veon Bell is going to score 20 fantasy points next year, and I have a sophisticated formula to calculate that, that projection is still more fragile than my wide receiver projections. It still has less certainty. It still needs to be discounted because there are so many things that can go wrong with Le'Veon Bell in 2017, more than can go wrong with Antonio Brown.
So how did your wide receivers end up then on that roster? You're saying you were thin, so where did you end up when you ended up with Tevin Coleman and Melvin Gordon and Le'Veon Bell?
So what we found is that in a dynasty context, year-to-year volatility is not nearly the same concern that it is in seasonal because you own Le'Veon Bell for life. Even if Le'Veon Bell underwhelms next season because of some of the forces I just outlined, he could easily bounce back and be the number one running back in football the following year. We've seen this with Jamal Charles. Out for a full season, and then he plays the next season, and he's the number one running back in fantasy, and then he's out the following season. But you had him for that one season where he was the number one running back in fantasy, and if you have a Jamal Charles or a Le'Veon Bell in a season in which they're performing at a high level, and they're healthy the entire season, that's a league winner. So for 1 year, you had Jamal Charles league winner. That's actually better than having another player who's performing above replacement, but he's not winning you a league in any given year. So in that way, sometimes the high annual volatility that is inherent in the running back position helps you in Dynasty in a way that it can cripple you in redraft. Because in redraft, you want to stay away from uncertainty and the higher bust risk in the early rounds. Not so in Dynasty leagues. If a player busts in 2017, okay, he could easily be the number one running back in fantasy the following year. I'll ride that volatility happily in Dynasty. I am avoiding it in redraft. And I had Rich Rebar on the Roto Underworld show last week, and he talked about the nature of the wide receiver position and how it's changing. Because quarterbacks are less inclined to throw wide receivers open and throw into coverage, what's happening across the league is you're seeing more quarterbacks like Marcus Mariota have to see throws before they make them. And what happens in that case? It's a boon for targets to the WR2 and the WR3. So the slot receivers and the auxiliary receivers are receiving a higher target share at the expense of the number one option. The primary receivers across the league, we saw this last year, their target share declined even though the run-pass ratio in the NFL was never more skewed to the pass than it was in 2016. We had the highest pass-to-run ratio in 2016 that we ever have, yet the primary wide receivers across the NFL saw their target share decline. What does that mean? It means that there is a smoothing out of production across the wide receiver position. The wide receiver position is becoming deeper and deeper and deeper. But the fact that the third receiver on a given team is outperforming previous year expectations doesn't matter in redraft. We're not rostering those wide receivers anyway. They're on the waiver wire. That's the stream in redraft. But in dynasty leagues, they're much deeper. Whereas a redraft league's 18 players, see dynasty leagues 28, 30, 35 players deep. So the dynasty leaguer can leverage this incredible depth that we're now seeing at the wide receiver position in a way that a redraft team owner could not. So that's what I did in this Ultimate Dynasty Podcast League. I leveraged an understanding that the wide receiver position is as deep as it's ever been, knowing I could get proven producers at the wide receiver position long after all the reliable running backs were off the board. Knowing that, you're incentivized to draft running backs with your early round draft capital. lock in the potential league winners, the Leveon Bells, who give you a competitive advantage in the years that they're performing up to expectations, and then bolster your roster with wide receiver twos. Hoard wide receivers in the later rounds. That's what I did with Le'Veon Bell, Tevin Coleman, Melvin Gordon, Duke Johnson, top heavy at the running back position, and then deep at the wide receiver position. Cole Beasley, Stephon Diggs, Deshaun Jackson, Jeremy Maclin, Eli Rogers, Tajay Sharp, Willie Snead. And by accumulating depth at the wide receiver position, it allows me to take advantage of the serendipity that happens. And already today, rumors have surfaced that Brandon Cooks could be traded. And who does that help? More than anyone else, Willie Snead dynasty owners.